We've been looking at some very simple examples, and because of that, a simple structure has been just fine. But in the real world of web app development, things get big and complex really quickly. So let's look at some ways to structure an application across multiple files in Express. In a real-world web application, you're going to end up with a lot of pages, a lot of endpoints, a lot of JavaScript. And so sticking it all in one app.js file just won't work. Now, we already have seen how modules let us separate and segment our code in reusable areas and separate it out so that it's easier to manage. So we'll do exactly that with our Express apps. But how might we create our modules then? What kind of architectural approach might we take? And the answer is, there's lots of options. Express is an unopinionated framework, meaning we have lots of choice. Now, Express does try to help us at least get an idea of what we might do. Under Getting Started, there's something called the Express Generator. This lets us very quickly create an application skeleton. But if I scroll down, and it's an npm global install, npm install Express Generator, so I'll be using it in the command line globally wherever I want, we can see that it actually generates a particular directory structure with particular files. We can see that we have an app.js file, a package.json, a public folder for static files, a views folder for views. We've seen all that. And they also have a routes folder, where each JS file essentially represents a /something in the URL. All right, let's try using this. But notice that Express itself says that there are many ways to structure Express apps. So using this is optional. But we'll look at it quickly as one possibility. So I'll go ahead and install on npm the Express-generator. And I'll do -g. It will be global, and we'll use it in the command line. That will go ahead and download it from the npm registry, install it globally, and then I'm just in an empty folder here that I created, and I can just say Express, and then say the name of the folder I want to create that will contain all of this code. Let's call it My App. And we can see that it created a bunch of files. Now I need to go in there, because it created a package.json, and do npm install. The package.json that was created by running Express and then the folder name has all of the things we need to run this app. All right, so let's go take a look at it. So I've opened it up in Visual Studio Code, and again I installed this inside an empty directory and then ran npm install in that directory, which pulled all of these dependencies that Express, the makers of Express, put into their sample app. So I've got middleware pieces. They use Jade as their view engine. And then I can see that basically most things work the same. I have a public folder. They have a bin folder in a www file where they actually set up their server. But they still have an app.js file that puts together the main pieces of their application. So feel free to install this and take a look around. The one thing I will point out that is different and something we haven't seen yet is this idea here of how they separate routes. They use the middleware and attach to a path. We've seen that. But the middleware they use in this case are two modules that are local. You see the routes is coming from the require and the routes directory and the index.js file, and users is coming from the require, the routes directory, and users.js file. And if I look inside, for example, the users.js file, I'll see something we haven't seen before, express.router. And all that really is router middleware. And the difference between what we did before and this is, as opposed to putting the gets and posts directly on the app, we put it on the router in the exact same way. And then what they're doing is exporting this router. So they have this router object and they add the gets and posts and deletes and whatever. But back in their app.js, once they get that value, like here, users, they say app.use and then set a path, and then within that path, the routes are processed. So essentially, this is going to take /users/ and then whatever is the matching routes inside this router. So for example, if this router had /add, then it would combine /users and the matching subroute within the router there and say /add. So if this was in your URL, it would match to /users and then would go looking in the middleware in here, find /add, and run that function. And so it essentially combines the two paths into one, and that's how you get the match. Now that's very useful when you're dealing with a large number of routes, especially a lot of routes underneath a particular parent. So if you have a lot of /users and /clothes and /admin, you could run your routes this way, with each set of routes being defined in its own JS file. So again, you can use the Express generator to generate this code, run npm install, and take a look around. It also gives you instruction on how to actually run it, because it puts a script inside package.json so you can run npm start and perhaps some specific settings depending on your operating system to get some different results. All right, so that's enough of this. This is one way of doing things, and I just wanted to point out routes since we hadn't seen them in case you try this. But we can also look at how we might do it otherwise, because again, this is an unopinionated framework. There's no one right way to do things necessarily. So let's try something else with the code we've already written. So I have my regular app.js file, the last one we saw, where we have some static assets, a view engine, a returning HTML in some cases, post, and we have our fake, not yet really working, JSON API. So that's fine, but let's imagine that we wanted to start separating this out into separate files, into modules. Or maybe we want to separate it out into things that return HTML and handle that, and things that are actually part of the API. So I could simply make a new folder, and in this case let's call it controllers, as in what's going to be in between the data and the view is sometimes called a controller. So it's controlling what data the view gets. And I can make a file, let's say htmlcontroller.js, and another file called apicontroller.js. And these will both be modules. So I'm going to do something with module.export. And again, I could do this a variety of ways. One good way to do it would simply be to pass the app around, because the app is an object, and so it will be passed by reference. And whatever I do to it, well, it will be reflected everywhere. So, for example, I could take these JSON API ones, take those out of there, and in my API controller, I could say module.exports is a function, and it takes the app. And then inside there, have my extra settings set. And that's it. Makes sense? So then all I would really have to do is in my app.js, I would need to require that. So I'll go ahead and require the API controller and go get it from ./controllers/API controller, and that's the .js file, and then say API controller, and I'll do it down here, app. So it will give the API controller the app. It'll be passed by reference down into this function, and the function adds the get, posts, and deletes. And I could do the same thing with all these other ones. So I'll say all of these, I'll put them in my HTML controller. I'll say exports is a function that takes an app, and do that. And again, pretty straightforward, pretty simple. And then I'll just have to require my HTML controller. It's just a module, and it exports a function that takes the app. So HTML controller app. So both of these lines are adding on to the app because it's passed by reference. Now, one other thing, we do use the JSON parser and URL encoded parser up here in the HTML controller. So I'll just go ahead and put those in the file. So we have a reference to that. And then I'll grab the body parser because I'm only using it in that file and stick it in there. So we have the proper references. And actually, the JSON parser is over here. So for now, we'll just get rid of that, just so that we have clarity. We could also include the body parser over in the API controller. Remember, require caches, so just calling require again wouldn't be expensive, and we could put a require statement over on this side. And in fact, I'll just get rid of this for now. Just something very simple since we're not using it anymore anyway. And so we have an HTML controller and an API controller separating different routes. All right, let's see if this works. I'll run nodemon app.js, get it started, and then go to localhost 3000, and there it is, it's running. And I can even do my post, and it outputted, and everything is working as expected. So I'm just taking the exact same code and splitting it up into module files. This is about organizing the structure of your application. So as things get big, you'll want to decide how you like splitting up the various things that you need to do in your app. And this is important for maintenance, for other coders who have to come in and use your code. And remember that modules is what Node has provided to make this easier. So we can separate our code into modules, pass things around, or use internal features like express.router in order to make it easier to organize our app. And if you're asking, what's the best way to do this? There is no specific answer. So try different things. Look at patterns out there on the internet. Look at some of this code. Look at the code in the Express generator. In general, though, you're going to be doing it with modules. So find something you're comfortable with, that you like, and use that. If it works well, if you find it easy to deal with after you've left your code for a while and come back to edit it, then you're probably okay. All right, let's move on.